kind of public health environment which is dominated by fear and by an overriding emphasis upon security and disease containment, I would argue. Now, the legacy of SARS, I think, was evident right through the scares over avian influenza over the past few years, but is still very much apparent in the way in which the international community and individual countries view the H1N1, or the so-called swine flu pandemic. The response to this shows that disease containment, surveillance, are emphasized, often at the expense of other very important things. Now, other speakers are going to talk later about the importance of individual immunity and boosting the immune system and what individuals themselves can do to protect their own health. What I'm going to do now is to emphasize another thing which I think has been largely neglected in this overriding emphasis upon security and upon disease surveillance and containment. And that's largely to do with farming practices. Now, before I just say something about that, I'll just say a little bit about public perceptions, because I've been talking mostly here about what governments and public health workers think. But in many cases, I think in the case of SARS and in the case of swine flu, public responses have, possibly even to a greater extent than they were in the 19th century, been led and conditioned very effectively by official channels of information. And the emphasis upon containment and surveillance is something which is affecting not just government institutions, but many private institutions. And my own university has a regular pandemic update on its website on the front page. And this, I think, is kind of indicative of on the one hand, of a very laudable desire to plan for an epidemic emergency, but it does also kind of stoke up the fear to some extent. And these fears could often be manipulated by unscrupulous individuals. I'm not saying the case of my own university, but I think more generally within society, there is a danger of this happening. Governments have also been very effective at stoking up kind of nationalistic views in relation to the swine flu pandemic. There's, for instance, in many countries, immediately after the outbreak occurred in Mexico, a number of governments took advantage of this, although there was no proven link between the export of meat in particular and the spread of H1N1. A lot of governments took advantage of this to impose quarantines and embargoes against pork from countries that were supposedly affected. So it was used basically to block trade and to bolster domestic industries. And in many countries, the stance of the government was often enjoyed a great deal of popular support because it really played upon both upon domestic economic interests and the governments were seen to be protecting those, but it also played upon nationalistic sentiments. But some communities obviously saw things and do see things very differently from the kind of security consensus that I've just spoken about. In the region that was first affected by swine flu, in Mexico, around the village of La Gloria, the meaning of the epidemic, or the outbreak at first, was very different. Locals associated this very quickly with the huge factory farm in which pigs were reared, owned by the giant Smithfield Corporation, a largely American-dominated corporation. And people associated the emergence of swine flu with the conditions in which the pigs were kept, the fact that they were kept very, very close together in cramped conditions. Now, of course, as soon as this rumor began, the Smithfield Corporation did its best to dampen down all this speculation. The Mexican government, no doubt under pressure, also tried to dampen down any kind of speculation of this sort. And what we see pretty early on in the pandemic, and I was watching this pretty closely, was that this emerging concern over the relationship between factory farming and the pandemic was closed down very much in public discourse. It was marginalized, and the emphasis upon disease curtailment, surveillance, upon providing vaccines, and all these things dominated the news media. They dominated the pronouncements of governments and of the international health organizations. And the potential link between factory farming and the influenza pandemic was effectively marginalized from public discourse. But what I think, and this is where I sort of come to my own views, what I think that the pandemic shows us, or at least one of the things it shows us, and about which the majority of people, including public health workers, sadly, have been silent, is that there's a very close link between not just factory farming and the emergence of these new pandemic diseases, but also, more generally, a link between urbanization, not just urbanization in the sense of lots of people being crowded together, producing ideal conditions for the circulation of epidemic diseases, but also because urbanization is generating the conditions in which factory farming, industrialized farming becomes necessary, in which it's booming. The very rapid urbanization which is occurring in parts, or has been occurring in many parts of the world, particularly say, Latin America, China, India, is creating a huge demand for meat products, particularly poultry and pig products, in the case of China. But this is not being supplied locally on farms connected with local communities, as it was in the past. This demand has to be supplied by large farms, often because many of the producers, the agricultural producers, are moving into the city. And the countryside, in many cases, is becoming denuded of people with any expertise in agriculture. So people are no longer producing for themselves and for the community. They're having to have food produced for them. And the massive expansion of cities in many Asian and Latin American countries is associated with a very massive expansion of factory farming. And of course, the global trade in animals, and possibly also in meat products, means that the diseases which are often generated in these factory farms circulate quite rapidly. And of course, in many parts of the developing world, the hygienic standards in factory farms are not as high as they are in, say, Europe and North America. Now, one of the reasons why these factory farms are, in a sense, influenza factories is because the influenza virus, although it's present as a reservoir within wild fowl, particularly within ducks, it can mutate rapidly in the context of intensive agriculture. So disease can, if a wild duck infects a domestic poultry, then the disease can then spread often quite easily to pigs, which are often reared in close proximity, and then through pigs, which are much closer genetically to human beings, into humans. Now, in these factory farms, the virus can mutate far more quickly than it could in much smaller farms. And so the dangers of new pandemic strains emerging and also of moving very quickly into very large human communities where they can't be effectively controlled is increasing all the time. This is a problem that is not going away. Although it would be, I think, as a historian in particular, would be remiss of me to